Hello and welcome to Planet Outlook. In this episode, my guest is Aarti Khosla. She is the founder and director of Climate Trends and the portal Carbon Copy. Climate Trends is a strategic communication initiative building a narrative around climate change. And we have seen that the IPCC report is very much in the news. So thank you, Aarti, first of all, for joining us on Planet Outlook.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Aarti, so just let's begin with the sixth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC report, which has been out for about 10 days now and is making a lot of noise. So your initial reactions on this report?
Well, the coverage of the report has spoken for itself. Of course, it is not good news. It's also pretty much the first time that scientists have put forward their estimation of how the world is warming in a way that it will definitely overshoot the 1.5 degrees of warming in every scenario that they have analyzed. And then only if the emissions are reduced in an extremely aggressive and an extremely sustained manner can that overshoot be brought back by the turn of the century to limit temperature warming to 1.5. So pretty much the fact that all scenarios that have been analyzed in the IPCC report show that the world will cross 1.5 is something that it says for the first time. But apart from that, every analysis over there is what the world knew before, but they have only been able to show that with higher confidence, whether it is for sea level rise, to which the world is committed now. That's what the report says, that even if climate action were to kick in today and extreme measures were taken, no way that you can stop sea level rise. So that's a committed impact that the world has now come into. And similarly with heat waves as well.
So, as you said correctly, this is not the first of the many warnings that the IPCC has given us. But do you think this will make a difference this time?
That is the whole point, it's a matter of political will in the end. Scientific analysis have been out even before. IPCC was started in 1988, and since then, 5 reports have come out. It feels that this year has also been quite a unique year in terms of climate impacts alone. When you have Western USA and places like Vancouver in Canada touching 49 degrees centigrade, we had forest fires in places like Siberia. The Arctic region had its lowest amount of ice in, I think, the last 1,000 years. So all these things have brought the climate discussion out in the open. It's no longer only limited at the annual negotiations. People are feeling all the impacts, whether it is forest fires or flooding or droughts. And to that extent, the politicians are feeling it as well. And therefore, the IPCC report actually comes out at a good juncture. After 2 years amiss with the COVID year last year, there is the United Nations Framework Convention meeting in November. And there is going to be a gathering which the UK government will host in Glasgow in Scotland. And the hope is that a lot of countries of the world will try and actually look at some climate action, because you see
let me interrupt you here. I will come to the COP26 a bit later, but here also India has welcomed this report, and even the environment minister had tweeted that we are basically one of the GOP countries which is fulfilling the targets which we have promised. So do you agree with that? When we are opening, we are also going very kind of aggressive on coal?
You see, there is a clear dichotomy here. India has made its commitments to the Paris Agreement mostly with power sector targets. And to that extent, the installation of renewables has been pitched as a very strong goal that India has aspired for, an achievement of that goal to be shown as climate action. But on the other hand, we don't talk about coming down on coal for various reasons that it's part of our development plan. We don't see, the demand that is met by coal to be easily met by renewables or by hydrogen, and the government is planning towards that. But clearly, there is a point in time now where it feels that if the government is still continuing to adopt an all the above approach, then that's not going to work. Because if you say that your targets are 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, which the Prime Minister recently said at the Independence Day speech, also Mr. R.K. Singh said at a recent meeting in Delhi as well. So these are going to be massive targets and they will change the way India is producing and consuming energy. So for them to be not wanting to say anything on coal is a paradox which the government will have to solve. We cannot have that approach pretty much that we create assets which will be stranded in the future and we build coal at the moment. We still have about, I think, 60 or 65 gigawatts of coal in the pipeline, and which means that that can come on by in the next 10 years. The question is, are we prepared to put that kind of investment into such industry which is going to be established for the next 40 years when there is no global interest in coal anymore? Investors don't want to put money into it, and even the Indian companies are not vying for it anymore. I mean, NTPC, which is our state thermal power producer, pretty much has a massive target for renewables. It wants to install almost 30,000 megawatts of renewables within the next 10 years. So game-changing stuff is happening. India has not said anything on coal, and there is international pressure. But more than international pressure, I think there will be a realization even within the government that that will have to be synthesized in a way that it makes sense even domestically. Our climate targets are not just for the world, it's also just the domestic impacts that coal expansion has on everything from not just on the socio-economic impact, but just the impact on the books and how the banks will see that as stranded asset, and that should be an important thing to consider.
So did you find it very strange when the word fossil fuel went missing from the summary, the 42-page summary for the policymakers? So everybody reads the summary. Most don't read the entire report. It's there in the report, but it's not there in the summary.
So you see, one thing is that this is a report which is the physical science basis. So the report as such is only supposed to talk about what is the state of science. There is going to be another report, which is the Working Group 3 report, which will talk about the mitigation that is needed. And I think to my understanding, that report will give in full detail what is needed for fossil fuel reduction and basically shifting away from traditional fossil fuel to clean. So as such, this report is not what needs to be done. It's really about what the situation is. That could be one of the reasons why it does not mention fossils per se, but the Working Group 3 report, which will talk about mitigation, will have to talk about it in full detail.
So when do we expect that report to come out? And I think there is more reports to be come out within.
There are 3 working groups. The Working Group 1 is the physical science basis, which got released. The Working Group 2 report will come in, I think, February next year, which is about impacts. So what are the impacts that are happening as a result of this level of climate change? That's the Working Group 2 report. The Working Group 3 report, if I'm not wrong, is around July next year, and will talk about what mitigation measures need to be adopted urgently to do what needs to be done. And then all of these will be put together into the full assessment report, which will be released in 2022.
So let's come back to then COP26, which will happen in November. So what are we expecting, as you were mentioning earlier?
So this COP is important to the extent that 2020 was the year of operationalization of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement is the only unified or collective agreement that the world has to deal with climate change, signed in 2015, but had to be operationalized or brought into force in 2020, which it did come into force. Now, there is a discussion pending on what are the rules of how the Paris Agreement will be implemented, what kind of transparency measures will apply to which countries. So, for example, there are some countries who might not be very well equipped to report what they have done on climate change. How much leeway will they get? How much flexibility is there? What kind of transparency mechanisms will be established so that everybody knows what other countries are doing? Even pending issues of how carbon markets will be treated. All of these issues were to be handled in the operationalization of the Paris Agreement. That is something which will be discussed. But as you see, there is a whole momentum that has also built up on, both net zero, which is bringing carbon emissions down to zero, neutral, and also on moving away from coal, because the power sector and action on power sector is almost 70% of the action that is needed to combat climate change. So, in the public discourse, there is a lot of discussion also on net zero by mid-century and no new coal. So, putting a dateline on not building further coal, but also retiring existing plants. So, I think this COP is going to be a combination in that way. It's important from the negotiations point of view, but from a narrative building and momentum building point of view as well. The UK government, even the US government, with the coming back of Biden and Kerry's trips across the world to basically, make large countries commit to net zero. The US has agreed to a mid-century net zero target. China has signed up to 2060. A lot of European countries have, said 2045. Some, I think, have even said 2035. Some, like Finland, or if I'm not wrong. So, there is a lot of mixed bag over there, and certainly it's easy for some of the European countries which have a good amount of forest, to even be able to look at reducing emissions, because in the end, net zero is not attained just by bringing emissions down. It is attained by bringing emissions down, plus also taking emissions out from the ecosystem. And the whole process of negative emissions is not an easy one. So I think the COP will have to deal with all of these issues, and the fact that it's happening after 1 year missed, there is huge global attention. There is UK government's desire to make it one of the biggest events in recent history, and all of that have made it quite an important event to keep an eye on.
But that's usually the thing, Aarti. For last 25 years, we have seen a lot of noise building up to every COP. Now, in retrospective, if you look at the last 25 COPs, it was a similar build-up, but the negotiations didn't go anywhere. It all were duds. Even last year, the UN had said none of the countries are kind of on course to meet any kind of targets. So what makes you so hopeful? I'm just saying.
Correct. And I think there is an issue of trust in this whole game as well. The matter on climate finance is something which looks like it's not going to be a reality anymore. The 100 billion discussion since 2009 has either been delayed or pushed back, and we are now in 2021 and it still doesn't seem possible. Even the way the Paris Agreement came into force was a huge moment in the world, but after that there was this whole thing of from Kyoto period, the pre-2020 actions, and pretty much it is clear that even the developed world acted in a way that their actions only contributed, I think, net 2 to 3% reduction that came from that whole Kyoto period emission reduction that the developed countries did. And now pretty much the goalpost has been shifted for all countries to take action. That's what Paris Agreement meant, that every country will submit their NDC. Basically, everybody will take action. The reason why I think the climate community is hopeful is simply because the impacts have become so massive that it's become just impossible to ignore. And while countries might not want to commit big goals internationally, they are indeed doing a lot of stuff nationally, which makes sense to their people, which makes sense for their cities, which just makes business sense for them. So in the end, there will be action. Action might not come in the shape and form that we see in a UNFCCC process, but there will have to be action. And, there are examples, and we can talk about it as well. Even in India, as you see, India is shying away from committing to a net zero goal at the moment, and rightly so. But there are things that are happening in terms of states coming up with climate action plans, states coming up with policies on transport and mobility and renewable installations and all of that. And eventually, there are things where climate is a co-benefit, especially in developing countries like ours. But there is a direct benefit that will also come just in terms of cleaner air or better, mobility in the city and so forth. So in the end, it's hard to say how all this will stack up. Your I think lack of optimism is rightly placed, but the only reason I feel there is a little bit of optimism is that this is indeed a crucial year. And leave aside 1.5, even if that's unattainable, to an extent, the world is really not prepared for the kind of disasters that are happening. And that's what the IPCC said. It's not one region, it's every region in the world and every country. They don't analyze country wise, they analyze region wise. That's what they have said, that every region is impacted. And the report authors are not authors from, a small group of people. They are basically authors from all across the world. We have authors from Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. We have IIT professors who have contributed to, the report, the IPCC report, and similarly across the world as well. So I think that's the reason of hope as well, that you in the end have to listen to the voice of science to some extent, and everybody needs to step up, because you cannot also push back everything to 2050, 2060. You have to say what you're doing now. So to that extent, it just feels that, it has to be in some time in the near future that some collective action or decision will have to be taken. And of course, the last 25 years have been quite a shifting of goalposts, for lack of any better phrase.
You mentioned this term net zero a couple of times. So I know net zero is the newest buzzword in the climate discussions. Is it becoming another jargon? Are we realistic about net zero?
If it is not dealt with properly, it will become another jargon. Because in the end, the responsibility to deliver net zero will be of those who are there in 2050 and not now. Therefore, unless 2050 or 2060 targets are not broken down into what will happen in 2030, 2040, it is going to be a waste. Because in the end, the road to 2050 will go through 2025 and 2030 and thereon, which is why a lot of the discussion on net zero at the moment seems very rosy, where you're giving a target of what you will do in 2060, but unless you don't match it with equal ambitious goals of 2025 and now, it does not make any sense. Europe tried to do this, to set midterm goals and targets as they set their Fit for 55 package. China, on the other hand, last year after COVID, installed almost 19,000 megawatts of new coal power plants because they wanted to give employment to people and just kind of bring back the economy. US, very interestingly, has signed for net zero, but the America $1 trillion job plan, which was Biden's big proposal, of how the economy will be changed. In that fund, there was, I think, a goal of decarbonizing the power sector by 2035, which basically meant that you generate electricity through clean sources only. That hasn't been able to come through. So, if big emitting nations are again beating the drum of net zero, but at the same time, not taking the right action that needs to be taken between now and the next 10 years, then net zero will be a kind of a monster message that we have created, but we don't know what to do about it.
But isn't it also a bit misleading, ecologically speaking? We need also carbon. We need carbon for life to sustain, kind of thing. we're talking about excess carbon, but putting excess carbon as net zero, is there somewhere again we are missing the point here?
To be honest, I don't know about this to the extent that the way I understand it is that certainly, we will have massive amount of, plantation to be done. We will have massive increase in forests that will be needed. And to that extent, yes, we hope that the amount of carbon that is needed will be supplied in the ecosystem. But this entire thing of sucking carbon out of the atmosphere is again not a very scalable option in the end. So how that's going to work out is something that needs to be figured. So in my mind, what I'm thinking also is that eventually it might be easy for a developed country to just attain net zero, because they can offset the same emissions in a least developing country which will not have the ability to do this. So it's also shifting the blame of pollution or whatever else you may say on a lower income country, and putting the onus of action on them, while the benefits or the fruits of climate action will actually go to the developed world and the first world countries who are able to do things far more rapidly, because that's how their economies have been. But to your point on a certain amount of carbon is needed in the system, yes, of course. I think at a point where we are at, even if action were to be taken today, the inertia in the system will make sure that there is more carbon than is ever needed. So that is never going to be completely sucked out. So I don't think we have that problem of so much carbon reduction that becomes detrimental. The problem really is of excess here and not of scarcity.
So I want to also come back to the things, just what you just said, is for the benefit of our viewers who are watching, just if you can explain this emission trading, the carbon markets that you just touched upon, the carbon credits. Now, how does it happen from a developed world to a developing country?
Correct, right. So, the principle of this is fairly straightforward, that you set a price for carbon and you trade carbon. Then what eventually happens is that as a company or as an industry or even as a country, if I'm able to bring down my carbon emissions, then it allows me to be able to sell, the fact that I have been able to reduce my emissions down. But on the other hand, there might be a company which is not able to reduce its emissions and does not have the technology to do it, or does not have, or in the case of countries, they don't have enough funds to bring down the emissions to that level. Then they are basically in a spot where they have to buy those credits. So a country or a company which is able to pollute less comes in a position where it is able to sell those credits, and those who are polluting more then eventually will buy. So it creates a kind of a market where I'm able to perform, and therefore I'm able to trade. And because there is a differential in the profile of, a country A and a country B can trade with each other, it just creates a system in the world where an individual country or an individual company are able to show that they have acted on climate by being able to either reduce emissions in absolute terms, or if not reduce them, then be able to trade them in some way. The problem with this system is that eventually climate change is a global issue and carbon is getting accumulated in the entire atmosphere. So, by reducing in one place and sort of offsetting in another place, you're not reducing the absolute carbon of the world. You're only displacing it from one place to another. And how much collective benefit it will give is, I think, to be seen, which is what had happened when the carbon trading mechanism, the CDM, was working a couple of years ago, and many institutional projects had applied, and there was a very vibrant market for carbon trade across the world. But the fact that it does not bring any real gains to the environment and it does not bring any real climate action At that point, it had, the carbon market system pretty much collapsed. But now, as you see the discussions on net zero, which are completely not possible without offsetting, because how else can you just make the carbon emissions neutral without offsetting them? This entire discussion of carbon markets has become quite alive. China has started an internal carbon market. Even Europe is in discussion. So, for example, the carbon border adjustment tax, which basically means that goods that will come into Europe, they want to make an assessment on whether or not they have been produced in carbon intensive ways. If goods have been produced in carbon intensive ways, then they are liable for more tax. So that also creates an unlevel playing field for at least a couple of years for countries like India. That also, the feeling also is that it's a protectionist measure which is trying to reduce imports from other countries, to spur or stir imports from within Europe and that kind of stuff. So there is a whole dimension of trade as well, in all of this, and it's I think that's the way eventually the world will have to see where it shakes out, because it's not the silver bullet for climate action. It's just one of the things which has its own pros and cons, and maybe more cons than pros.
My last question before I let you go, you also look at air pollution and clean air. And in a couple of weeks' time, we will be kind of heading into another air pollution season. So if you can just briefly touch upon the impacts of air pollution, climate, and have we kind of taken the right steps for mitigation, or are we still in the dark?
So, see, air pollution in India has become quite a big concern in some circles. Certainly for people who are living in Delhi, like me, it's of prime concern for part of the year. I think the debate within policymakers and the government has become quite strong. They have to acknowledge it. It is not 5 years back. It is not like 5 years back where you say that air pollution does not cause any death. I don't think any decision can be made in today's time by making such a statement. In terms of whether the actions have been cracked or not, it's extremely hard to say. You look at the National Clean Air Plan, which is supposed to bring down air quality 30% from 2017 levels by 2023. We are way off that target, clearly, and that's for 122 cities across the country. In terms of actions, we did some analysis just to see what kind of actions some cities are taking. So, we took some 15, 20 cities across the country and figured out where the money is being spent. Turns out maximum money was being spent for doing things like water sprinkling on the road or buying automated sweepers and that kind of stuff. So, we cannot put band-aids on tumor. And then we had this news of smog towers being constructed in Delhi, which is pretty much like putting an air conditioner out in the open, thinking that it will cool the place. So, these kind of misdirected measures seem that they are counterintuitive. But at the same time, because the National Clean Air Program is the only policy level goal that India has, it's led by the Ministry of Environment and Forest. It's the responsibility of all the pollution control boards. They have set up a very unique tripartite arrangement where, they have paired up the state pollution control boards with the municipal corporations, the urban local bodies, and they've also attached some institutes of repute. So there are many IITs, there are other research institutes, academic institutes, hospitals like the PGI Chandigarh, who are now attached to all of these state boards and municipal corporations. And the hope is that, this tripartite mechanism will create at least some kind of progress in the next 2 or 3 years, because otherwise there is so much talk on air pollution, but and data shows data just shows that so for Delhi recently there was this report which said that Delhi's air has cleaned over the last 2 or 3 years. Since 2018, 19 and 20, there has been an improvement. The thing is that, as you're living as a Delhiite, if you don't see the improvement in the local area that you're living in, then it's very hard to say. And if you're seeing an average which is 5 times what the safe limit is, then what is the improvement that we are talking about as well? So I feel that, the connecting of the dots, even between how the climate benefit and air quality benefit and public health benefit will come, is still something that has started, but even mostly among the think tank community, the NGO community, and the converts, it hasn't really gone ahead and, assumed a shape among some of the decision makers where it becomes a thing of primary importance.
Thank you so much, Aarti. Thank you so much for these insights, and best of luck for your new venture on carbon copy and climate trends. It has been an
Thanks very
absolute
much,
pleasure
Ananda.
to have you on Planet Outlook. Absolute pleasure.
It was nice to talk to you. Thanks very much for having me again. Thank you.